So this is the second part of our discussion of Chapter 3 from American Media History, the Press and the Founding of a Nation. In the last segment, we spent most of our time talking about the two political parties that emerged after the Revolutionary War, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, as well as the newspapers and editors that became the mouthpieces for the politicians and the political parties. The overriding purpose of the press during this time was to serve a partisan cause, meaning represent one or the other party. The press was the most important medium for distribution of news and views. One thing that's not talked much about in our text is the commitment that Congress had to the free exchange of ideas. On the one hand, somebody like Thomas Jefferson wanted to actually have the federal government fund distribution of newspapers completely. His argument was that if there were any cost or any expense in getting a newspaper, it was fundamentally a tax and therefore prohibited free speech and freedom of the press. People like James Madison said it would be unrealistic to distribute all kinds of news with no cost. The upshot was that the postal system was established, and up until the very early part of the 1800s, the primary purpose of the postal system was to distribute newspapers. There was a lower cost. They were not free, but it was certainly a lower cost than any other type of postage. And to this day, we have a federally subsidized postal system for printed works. We call it the book rate now, but it is a reflection of the commitment to the distribution of information and ideas in democracy that the founding fathers had. So at any rate, the newspapers were not supported by subscriptions, but were funded by the political parties for whom they spoke. And the role of the reporter was not to be objective in any way, but in fact to improve what the politician said. So let's talk about Washington and the press. President Washington was our first president and held the office for 2 terms. He saw the press as important for commerce and for information, but he was the subject of such virulent criticism from the Anti-Federalists that he really became ambivalent about it while he was president. He publicly supported a free press to provide citizens with information that they need, but he complained about it privately. And when he was finished being president, he actually stopped reading newspapers for some time because he was just so discouraged about the quality or lack thereof. A few characteristics of the 20th century and 21st century press emerged during Washington's terms. First, we have the freedom to criticize an incumbent president without fear. Now, we'll see a bit later that this was considered seditious libel, and Congress passed a law that made it illegal, but it didn't last. So what we have is a precedent to be able to criticize a sitting president if he's running again without fear. Also, Washington developed the ability to manage the press, and he did so by leaking information to sources that he felt would present him in the most positive light. So newspapers then established a precedent of getting information from a variety of open and leaked sources, and presidents then and now work very hard to manage the press. As I said, Washington still advocated the free press after his presidency, but he did not use the press as a personal political weapon, and he certainly didn't approve of those who did. John Adams was our second president. This view of the press did not change. He was also a Federalist, and he also used the press as a tool for his political party. John Adams, you may know, was a skilled writer. He wrote for many, many years. He was involved in the writing of the Constitution and in the writing of the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence. So he was a very influential voice in the new country. He came under fierce attack from the anti-federalists, who were concerned now with Washington being in office for 2 terms and now another federalist. They saw power being consolidated in just a few, and this was the thing that the anti-federalists feared the most. John Adams believed, that the press ought to present America in the best possible light and should remain silent in the face of attack. Thomas Jefferson was an anti-federalist president, our 3rd president. Nothing shook his belief in the press. You'll remember the quote that we read about his rather having a newspaper than rather being governed. But he felt very strongly that people needed to be informed to be governed. Therefore, he was an advocate of public education and literacy. He understood that the effectiveness of the press was in proportion to those who could read. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. It was designed to silence dissent in preparation for the young country, the United States, going to war with France. And there was, the public were being whipped up to fear all things that were French. Now, it's true that some of the French people who were in the new United States had come from France and were escaping the revolution there, the terror, but many others had come from the Caribbean nations. So the first part of this act is essentially about citizenship. And so to be a citizen, you had to live in the country for 14 years instead of 5, and the president had the legal right to expel any foreigners that he considered to be dangerous. I hope you're seeing some parallels with the immigration conversations that we're having in politics today. But the one that we're mainly interested in with respect to the press is the Sedition Act. Any false, misleading, or scandalous writing against the government to stir up sedition could be punishable by fine and prison. This was a clear violation of the First Amendment, and John Adams knew it, but he insisted that it was a war measure. I'll ask you to think if you can think of any contemporary laws that might be considered equivalent or similar to this. The real intent, though, according to the Federalists, was to stifle, the real intent, according to the Anti-Federalists, was to stifle the Anti-Federalist press. Nearly everyone who was arrested and everyone who was imprisoned were Anti-Federalist editors. So repealing the Alien and Sedition Act was an important platform for Thomas Jefferson when he ran against Adams in 1800. So the Sedition Act was not repealed, but it expired in 1801. But there was an important case that we should know about that happened in 1803. Harry Croswell was the editor of the Federalist Wasp. He deeply criticized, he hated Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson was so sick of the criticism and the attacks from the press, and Croswell in particular, that he agreed that Croswell should be arrested and tried for seditious libel as an example. Now, what Croswell did is that he claimed that Jefferson had paid an anti-Federalist writer to write against Adams, and he also leaked the story that Thomas Jefferson had had a child with his slave, Sally Hemings. Jefferson had had it up to here, and so despite his belief in the free press, he condoned the arrest and trial of Harry Croswell. The trial court found him guilty. He appealed to a higher state court, and out of that came the Hamilton defense. Now, Croswell was not vindicated, but the Hamilton defense became the basis of our libel law that stands today. Hamilton defense is truth plus good motives for justifiable means. So even though Croswell lost, it led to the first libel act in New York that made truth the absolute defense against libel. In our next segment, we'll draw some conclusions about the partisan press time.